I had just returned from burying my father-in-law, a Vietnam veteran, Purple Heart recipient, and a man who had been more of a father to me than my own ever was, when I saw the bright pink slip taped to our front door. At first, I thought it was another one of those HOA flyers about street sweeping or trash bin alignment. But no. It was an official notice of violation and intent to fine. My wife hadn't even taken off her black dress. Her mother, Susan, who had just lost her husband of 42 years, was sitting inside, barely speaking. And yet, somehow, this woman named Karen, the HOA president, decided that today, yes, the very next day after the funeral, was the perfect time to issue an eviction notice to my grieving mother-in-law. I stood there, holding that paper, staring at the fine print. Karen had scribbled in blue ink, "Unauthorized guest, 48 hours to vacate." My hands trembled, not with sadness but with something sharper, something colder. Karen didn't know it yet, but she had just made a legal mistake of federal proportions. See, I don't just own this house. I also wear a black robe 5 days a week and sentence people like her in federal court. And now? Now she was about to find out exactly what it feels like to be held in contempt. It all started 3 weeks earlier when Susan arrived at our home with 2 small suitcases and a folded American flag. The same flag that had just draped her husband's casket. She wasn't planning on staying forever, just long enough to breathe again without crying. We had the space. We had the love. What we didn't have, apparently, was Karen's permission. You'd think a neighborhood with 2 cul-de-sacs and a duck pond wouldn't need a tyrant, but Karen filled that void like it was her calling. She walked around with a clipboard like she was part of a one-woman SWAT team, special whiners and tyrants. My wife and I had already received warnings in the past. One for non-compliant mailbox paint, whatever that meant, and another because I dared to park my car with the rear tires half an inch over the driveway line. But we never imagined she'd come for Susan. Not after what we'd just been through. The funeral had been beautiful and brutal. A 21-gun salute, bagpipes, tears, and silence. Susan didn't say a word the entire car ride home. She sat in the back seat, clutching the flag, staring out the window like her world had been switched off. That night, we made her tea and offered her our guest room. My wife tucked her in like a child. It was quiet, respectful, sad. Until the next morning, when Karen showed up with a smile too wide and too fake to be anything but dangerous. I opened the door still in my pajamas. She didn't even say good morning. "We need to talk about the long-term guest staying on your property." I blinked. "I'm sorry." The older woman. "She's not on the deed or the lease agreement. HOA Code 7B prohibits non-resident guests from staying more than 48 hours without board approval." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. "Karen, she just lost her husband. Yesterday. You saw the funeral procession. You live 3 doors down." Karen nodded like she was a therapist about to diagnose me. "I understand grief, but we all have rules to follow. Exceptions make chaos. Chaos leads to property value decline." My brain short-circuited trying to process the leap from grief to property value, but Karen was already pulling papers from her folder. She handed me a violation notice and said in that syrupy voice, "Let's get this cleared up before we have to escalate things." I didn't respond. I just closed the door in her face, slowly and deliberately. That should have been the end of it. But of course, it wasn't. Later that day, I called the HOA office to request an emergency board meeting. I assumed, stupidly, that a little human decency might prevail. But when I arrived at the community center, Karen was waiting with 2 of her hand-picked board members, Ron and Linda, both of whom I swear have no actual purpose in life other than to nod whenever Karen talks. "She's still in the house?" Karen asked, pretending to be surprised. I sat down, keeping my face unreadable. "Susan is my wife's mother. She's staying temporarily after her husband's funeral." Ron muttered something about protocol. Linda brought up a case from 2018 when a resident let their niece visit for too long. I listened. Quietly, like a man counting chess pieces. When they finished pretending to deliberate, Karen folded her hands. We've decided to uphold the violation. You'll receive a fine of $5,000 and must have the guest removed within 48 hours. No one flinched. No one blinked. I smiled. Great, I said. In that case, I'll be filing a formal injunction in federal court under the Fair Housing Act, citing harassment, discriminatory enforcement, and emotional trauma against a grieving military widow. Karen froze. Oh, I added casually, and I'll be doing it with my full credentials as a sitting United States federal judge. You could hear the wind leave the room. Karen tried to stammer something, but her mouth suddenly forgot how to form syllables. I stood up and calmly walked out of the room. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I simply made it clear that the game she was playing was now being upgraded to a level she had no training for. That night, my wife and I sat with Susan, who still didn't know the full extent of what had happened. We let her talk about her husband, about his jokes, his terrible cooking, his love of Sinatra. We didn't tell her that Karen had tried to kick her out. Not yet. She didn't need more pain. But I needed justice, and now that I had officially opened the door to legal retaliation, I was going to do it by the book, but with enough flair to make Karen wish she had picked literally anyone else to mess with. Because grief has a strange way of fueling resolve. And I was just getting started. The following morning, I sat on my back porch sipping coffee as the neighborhood's self-appointed overlord strutted up the sidewalk with her trademark folder tucked beneath one arm. The birds weren't even done singing yet, and already, Karen was on her rounds, clipboard in hand like a traffic warden with a grudge against joy. I watched her approach from the corner of my eye, and sure enough, she stopped in front of my house and stared, no, glared, at the blinds as if her vision alone could penetrate the walls and discover some terrible HOA violation like insufficiently cheerful curtains. When I didn't move, she pulled out her phone, snapped a picture of our front yard, and walked off in a huff. That confirmed it. She was escalating. And I was more than ready. Later that afternoon, I received a new email from the HOA office. The subject line read, "Escalated violation notice, immediate compliance required." I opened the attachment, and there it was in all its absurdity. An accusation that we had failed to register a long-term guest, and a claim that Susan's presence posed a risk to community order and parking logistics. Parking logistics. The woman didn't even own a car. She barely remembered to put on her shoes most mornings. But the real kicker came at the bottom of the document. Karen had authorized the hiring of private neighborhood security to enforce guest regulations, which essentially meant she had paid someone to stalk our property under the guise of HOA enforcement. I called the number on the notice. It went straight to voicemail. I didn't bother leaving a message. I already knew the next step. That evening, while Susan was quietly watching a rerun of her favorite detective show, and my wife was finishing up dinner, I opened my laptop and got to work. I drafted a formal complaint under the Fair Housing Act, citing harassment, retaliatory enforcement, and targeted discrimination. I also included a section referencing the Protecting Tenants at Foreclosure Act, which, while not entirely applicable, made the legal tone even heavier. Then I added a few words that I knew would really tighten the screws: emotional damages, defamation of character, and a reference to elder abuse statutes in the state. It was a thing of beauty, really, cold, precise, irrefutable. The following day, I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting in person, just to deliver a little theatrical forewarning before letting the legal train roll through. The meetings were held in the community clubhouse, which always smelled faintly of stale cookies and air freshener battling a mold problem. Karen sat at the center of a long folding table, flanked by her loyal minions. Ron, the semi-retired insurance adjuster who treated bylaws like gospel, and Linda, whose main qualification seemed to be her ability to repeat the phrase, "property values," on command. Karen looked up as I entered and narrowed her eyes, clearly hoping I'd just stay home and sulk. Instead, I walked up to the public speaking podium and placed a manila folder directly in front of her. She hesitated before opening it, scanning the pages as the color drained from her face. I remained silent, letting the words on the paper speak for themselves. Her fingers twitched. Ron leaned over to get a look and immediately adjusted his glasses. Linda started whispering something about precedent. Karen cleared her throat, straightened up, and said, "We will take this under advisement." I didn't move. "This isn't a request," I said. "This is a formal notice of pending legal action. You'll also find the initial report I'm forwarding to the State Housing Commission." A long, awkward silence followed. Karen stared at me, attempting to hold on to her smugness, but it wavered. Just a bit. She tried to pivot. "This is not personal, you understand. We have rules. We treat every violation the same." I raised an eyebrow. "Then perhaps you'd like to explain the variance granted to board member Ron's niece last month. The one who stayed for 6 weeks without registration. Or Linda's sister, who parked her RV in the cul-de-sac for a month while repainting her house." Their eyes widened. The room went quiet except for the faint buzz of the overhead fluorescent light. Karen stammered, "That's different. They submitted the proper paperwork." "No," I replied calmly, "they submitted nothing. I've already checked. I have a copy of the guest logs, and I've reviewed the minutes of every board meeting for the last 12 months. I let the silence settle again, heavier this time. I turned on my heel and left, not because I was finished, but because I wanted the image of me walking out, calm, confident, unbothered, to burn into their minds. A judge's walkout had a certain flair to it when done right. And based on the quiet panic behind me, I had nailed it. 3 nights later, the security contractor Karen had hired made the mistake of trying to enter our backyard without a warrant or permission. Susan had been watering her flowers when he appeared behind the fence with a clipboard and a camera. My wife saw him from the kitchen window and called out, prompting him to mutter something about a routine inspection. I stepped outside and asked him for his badge number. He didn't have one. I asked what agency he worked for. He just stammered and backed away, mumbling that he was with Community Services. That's when I called the police. 2 officers arrived within minutes. The security guard tried to explain that he had been hired by the HOA and was just doing his job. But the officers didn't buy it. They asked for his credentials. He had none. They asked if he had permission to enter the property. He didn't. He was escorted off the premises and cited for trespassing. I later learned from one of the officers, who also happened to live in the neighborhood, that this wasn't the first time Karen had pulled something like this. She had previously tried to fine a single mother for illegal trampoline usage, and once filed a complaint against a teen with a lemonade stand for unregulated commercial activity. Word began to spread around the neighborhood. People started reaching out, quietly at first, with their own stories of Karen's absurd power trip. One man told me she fined him for planting marigolds instead of HOA-approved begonias. Another said she threatened to tow his car for having a bumper sticker that read "Retired, not expired." Every story made it clearer. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was enforcing control. And now, for the first time, someone was fighting back. Then came the twist I hadn't anticipated. A board member named Rick, one of Karen's more silent allies, knocked on my door late one evening. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder like someone in a spy movie. "I don't agree with what she did," he said quietly. "I wanted you to know. I kept records. Karen's been bending the rules for years. I think it's time someone put a stop to it." He handed me a flash drive, thanked me, and walked away. I went inside, plugged it in, and began to listen. Karen's voice filled the room, crisp and clear. "We can't let them get away with it. If we make an example out of the widow, the rest will fall in line." That was it. The final piece. Karen had declared war. But now, she was about to find out just how brutal a legal war could get when your opponent wears the robe. I sat alone in my home office, the soft hum of my desktop fan the only sound besides the faint clicking of my keyboard. The file Rick had given me wasn't just a smoking gun, it was a full-blown arsenal. Hours of audio recordings, dated emails, HOA chat logs, and even a few scanned handwritten notes that made my jaw tighten. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules selectively. She was building a kingdom. A petty, paranoid little empire propped up by fear and passive-aggressive notices. I clicked through folders labeled Board Strategy, Fines to Push, and one especially curious one titled Target List. Inside that last one, I found a spreadsheet categorizing neighborhood residents into groups: compliant, annoying, probationary, and watch list. My name had 3 red asterisks next to it. Susan's name, yes, my grieving mother-in-law, was marked as problem guest. Next to it, a comment in Karen's own handwriting said, "Make her leave or make it expensive." My teeth clenched. I'd seen hardened criminals speak with more humanity in my courtroom. The most damning recording was from a board strategy meeting Karen had held in her backyard. She apparently forgot, or didn't realize, that Rick had left his phone recording. Her voice was unmistakable, syrupy with malice. "This is about setting an example," she said. "If we let people make exceptions, soon we're overrun with freeloaders, family members, renters, cousins. It starts with a grieving widow and ends with people painting their mailboxes neon green. Order matters." Another voice, probably Linda's, chimed in with a weak laugh. Karen continued, "We go soft on one violation, and everyone else starts testing the fences. You want to live without rules? Move to the woods." It would have been hilarious if it weren't so sinister. Karen spoke like she was running a private gated utopia under siege, not a sleepy cul-de-sac with yoga moms and golden retrievers. I saved all the files to an external drive and backed them up to the cloud, just in case. Karen had already shown a willingness to trespass and harass. I wasn't about to underestimate her. The next step was formal discovery. I drafted a subpoena request to obtain official HOA financial records, security contracts, and the minutes from all board meetings from the past 2 years. I worded it so that it didn't just ask for documents, it demanded transparency. If there was any misuse of funds or proof that Karen had exceeded her authority, I would find it. And based on the digital paper trail Rick had handed me, there was a lot to find. It turned out that Karen had approved several expenses without board-wide vote. Things like a $3,200 perimeter monitoring system, which I suspected was just her buying a drone off Amazon and giving it to her nephew. There was also a $1,100 invoice labeled Community Security Audit, but the file contained nothing but a photo of a locked gate and a handwritten note that read, "All clear." That drone, by the way, had been buzzing near our backyard again. I noticed it while watering the rose bushes Susan had planted as part of her healing process. I watched it hover above the fence, its tiny black form flitting back and forth like a nosy insect. This time I was ready. I'd installed a jamming device in our upstairs window, completely legal, low range, and only effective in a short radius. As the drone tried to move in for a closer look, it suddenly dropped 6 feet and spun erratically before drifting off toward Karen's house like a drunk bee. I waved at it as it retreated. Susan, bless her heart, had no idea we were living in the middle of a HOA Cold War. Word was getting around. After my silent mic drop at the board meeting and the incident with the fake security guard, neighbors began stopping by with their own stories. A man named Gerald, who lived across the street, admitted he'd been fined 3 separate times for overly decorative lawn gnomes. One of those fines was issued when he didn't even have gnomes out. Karen had used an old photo. A young couple 2 doors down had been reported for suspicious gatherings, which turned out to be their weekly Dungeons and Dragons group. Karen had actually referred to them as occult adjacent. These weren't isolated incidents. This was a pattern, a campaign. And now, finally, it was being exposed. Rick emailed me again. He'd managed to extract old board member resignation letters. Several of them referenced toxic leadership and moral discomfort. One even included a direct warning: Karen is going to get this board sued one day. I added it to the file. Karen was so focused on controlling everyone else that she'd left herself wide open. No insurance policy could protect against this level of negligence. The lawsuit I was preparing wasn't just personal anymore, it was structural. Then, in an almost cartoonish act of desperation, Karen sent out a neighborhood-wide email with the subject line "Clarification on Community Safety Measures." It was a rambling, defensive message filled with half-truths and veiled jabs. She insisted that the drone was part of a pilot program to protect against trespassing. She called the private security hire a regrettable overreach by a third-party vendor. And she referred to Susan only as an unregistered occupant. Nowhere in the email was there an ounce of remorse, apology, or even acknowledgement that what she had done might have caused someone pain. Instead, Karen wrote, "We must remain vigilant in preserving our neighborhood standards, even when it is uncomfortable." That line stuck with me. I copied it into my note. It was the kind of statement that a judge would love to read aloud in a courtroom, right before handing down a verdict. That night, I sat with my wife on the porch. She looked tired but grateful. Susan was asleep inside, finally resting more peacefully than she had in weeks. My wife turned to me and asked, "Do you think she'll back down now?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I watched the wind stir the leaves of the oak tree in our front yard. The same tree Karen had once complained about for dropping acorns too aggressively. "No," I finally said. "She won't back down. She'll dig in harder. But that's okay. Let her. The deeper she digs, the easier it'll be to bury her case." And I was right. The next morning, another violation notice arrived. This one cited excessive porch furniture, even though all we had was a swing bench and 2 chairs. It was signed by Karen herself, in thick blue ink, as if she wanted to make sure we knew it was personal. I smiled as I folded the paper. It was more evidence, more proof, more rope for her to hang herself with. I placed it neatly in the folder labeled Exhibit C, took a sip of coffee, and looked over at the courthouse summons I had printed the night before. It was time to let Karen know she wasn't dealing with just another homeowner. She was dealing with a federal judge who had all the patience in the world, and a bulletproof legal case locked, loaded, and ready for trial. The summons was delivered on a bright, cloudless morning, the kind of day that usually meant joggers and sprinklers and the smell of fresh mulch in the neighborhood. But this day came with something extra. A uniformed process server walking up Karen's front walkway with calm, deliberate step. I watched from my living room window as he knocked once, twice, and waited. Karen opened the door wearing one of her floral robes, the kind with shoulder pads and a collar like she was about to host a formal brunch in 1982. She took one look at the envelope in his hand and went rigid. I couldn't hear the conversation, but her face said enough. First disbelief, then confusion, then something like panic, expertly masked beneath a forced smile. She accepted the documents with a tight nod, closed the door, and vanished inside. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. The line had officially been crossed. The lawsuit wasn't just a civil complaint. It was a well-researched, legally sound hammer blow detailing discriminatory enforcement, harassment, emotional damages inflicted on a grieving widow, misuse of HOA authority, and unlawful surveillance. I had included every relevant statute, backed by evidence from Rick's files, my own collected violations, and sworn statements from 5 other neighbors who had been burned by Karen's reign of pettiness. The language was precise, professional, and impossible to wriggle out of. Karen wasn't facing a slap on the wrist. She was staring down the barrel of a full-blown federal suit with teeth. It didn't take long for the neighborhood to catch wind of what had happened. The grapevine in our community was faster than any broadband service. By noon, people were whispering at mailbox clusters, texting screenshots of the email chain I'd attached to the filing, and speculating wildly. Someone even posted a vague but unmistakable status on the neighborhood Facebook page. Guess it finally happened. Power trip hits a brick wall. Stay tuned. That post got 37 likes in the first hour. Karen had always cultivated fear, but now she was facing something far more dangerous: exposure. The following day, Karen called for an emergency board meeting. I attended, of course, because watching her squirm in a room full of folding chairs and plastic water pitchers was not something I was going to miss. She tried to put on a brave face, even wore a blazer this time instead of her usual HOA logo polo. But the tension in her jaw betrayed her. Ron and Linda sat beside her, but noticeably more reserved than usual. Rick, seated quietly at the end, nodded at me when I walked in. Karen started the meeting with a short statement. She referred to the lawsuit as an unfortunate misunderstanding and claimed it was motivated by personal emotion rather than facts. I nearly laughed. She then attempted to frame the situation as a targeted attack on her role as HOA president. The irony, of course, was that the facts were precisely what she had underestimated. I requested the floor. She hesitated but couldn't find a valid reason to deny it. I stood up, calmly laid down a folder labeled Exhibits A through E, and began to speak. I explained in simple terms how the HOA had stepped outside the bounds of its authority. I read directly from her own email in which she referred to Susan as a rule-breaking liability. I played one of the cleaner voice recordings from Rick's collection where Karen said, "They want sympathy points? Find them harder." Several people gasped. Ron looked down. Linda shuffled some papers she wasn't actually reading. Karen stared forward, expression frozen, like someone caught in the middle of a nightmare with no escape route. That night, things got worse for her. A local news outlet, tipped off by one of the neighbors who worked at the station, ran a small segment titled "Grieving Widow Targeted by HOA?" It was a quick 2-minute piece, but it hit hard. The anchor mentioned my position as a federal judge and how the HOA was facing legal scrutiny over abuse of authority and potential elder harassment. They even aired a brief interview with one of the elderly neighbors who had been fined for improperly angled wind chimes. He looked into the camera and said, "It's not about the rules. It's about control. And we've all had enough." Karen's panic moved from subtle to full bloom. The next morning, she sent out a community-wide email titled "Urgent Clarification on Recent Legal Matters." It was 3 paragraphs of vague justifications, flimsy denials, and thinly veiled threats of counteraction. She claimed her leadership had protected the community from chaos and decay, and that her enforcement methods had been uniform and necessary. I read it once, then printed a copy for court. She was building her own noose, and every email she sent tightened it just a bit more. Meanwhile, I met with my legal team to prepare for the upcoming hearing. While I could have represented myself, I wanted distance from the case on paper to avoid any perceived conflict of interest. My friend Natalie, a brilliant civil litigator, agreed to lead. We gathered affidavits, digital evidence, witness statements, and past violation reports showing a pattern of targeting specific individuals, mostly the elderly, single parents, and families with any sort of non-traditional living arrangement. Natalie's favorite piece was still the spreadsheet with the watch list and Karen's color-coded labels. She held it up like a trophy. "We should frame this," she said. "It's the HOA equivalent of a villain's diary." The day of the preliminary hearing arrived. Karen showed up in an ill-fitting gray pantsuit with a lawyer who looked like he had been plucked off a bus bench advertisement. His tie was crooked, and he spent most of the pre-hearing shuffle flipping through Karen's disorganized paperwork. I didn't even need to speak. Natalie handled everything with surgical precision. She introduced the evidence, referenced precedent, and presented our complaint with a clarity that made Karen's defense look like a hastily assembled school project. The opposing lawyer kept objecting to things that weren't objectionable. At one point, the judge asked him directly, "Are you familiar with the Fair Housing Act?" He stammered, then muttered, "Somewhat." The judge, a colleague I knew only distantly, reviewed the files for several long minutes in silence. When he looked up, he simply said, "There is more than enough here to proceed to a full trial. The evidence suggests a clear pattern of abuse and discriminatory enforcement. We will schedule the hearing accordingly." Karen's face went pale. Her lawyer began gathering papers like the ship was sinking. Ron and Linda, both present, looked like they wanted to vanish into the seat. As we walked out of the courtroom, cameras from the same news station were waiting. Natalie made a short statement about protecting vulnerable individuals from overreach and how community authority should never be used as a weapon. I didn't speak to the press. I didn't need to. The narrative was writing itself, and Karen's unraveling was now a public spectacle. Back at home, Susan was sitting in the garden, sipping tea and humming something soft. She looked peaceful, almost unaware of the storm that had been raging just beyond the fence. My wife joined her, bringing fresh cookies, and for a moment everything felt normal again. It was exactly why I had started this fight. Not for revenge. Not for power. But to give that moment of peace back to someone who had already lost so much. The trial would come. The fallout would be messy. But for now, Karen's empire had cracked. And soon, it would collapse entirely. The trial came faster than Karen had anticipated. There were no delays, no continuances, no 11th-hour technicalities to save her. Once the evidence was in motion, the judicial machine did what it does best. It kept moving. By the time Karen realized the scale of the battle she had provoked, it was far too late to retreat. Her lawyer made a last-ditch attempt to settle quietly, offering to drop all fines and issue a formal apology, but that offer came with no restitution, no admission of wrongdoing, and no commitment to change the structure of the HOA. It was little more than an empty gesture, and we declined without hesitation. This wasn't just about Susan anymore. It was about every neighbor she had tried to intimidate, every homeowner she had punished without cause, and every time she had used her clipboard like a scepter of control. The courtroom was packed on the day of the trial. Not just with legal counsel and interested parties, but with neighbors. Dozens of them. People who had quietly endured Karen's reign showed up in person, some even taking time off work to witness the proceeding. There was a shared energy in the room, a sense that something long overdue was finally being addressed. Susan came, too. She sat beside my wife, hands folded neatly in her lap, watching everything unfold with calm dignity. She hadn't spoken much in the days leading up to the hearing, but when she arrived in that simple blue dress with her hair pinned back and that tiny American flag pin on her collar, I knew she was ready. Natalie opened our side with a presentation that was, in her own words, not just a legal argument but a story. She walked the court through the sequence of events. The funeral, the notice, the threats, the trespassing, the surveillance, the fines. Then she detailed the broader pattern of harassment inflicted upon other residents, using testimony from neighbors, board member resignations, and, most powerfully, Rick's voice recordings. Every word out of Karen's mouth played back in court cut through the air like a blade. She sounded petty, vindictive, calculated. There was no way to spin it. The judge took notes silently, occasionally raising an eyebrow or exchanging glances with the clerk. Karen's defense was weak. Her lawyer tried to argue that the HOA had simply been doing its job, that the bylaws allowed for enforcement, and that any oversteps were procedural at worst. But when confronted with the spreadsheet of resident categories, the drone footage, and the handwritten notes targeting Susan, the defense collapsed into excuses. Karen refused to testify. Her lawyer advised against it, clearly realizing her performance in open court would only make things worse. Her silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. The verdict was swift. The court found the HOA guilty of harassment, discrimination, and willful misconduct. Karen, specifically, was found liable for abuse of power under civil statutes, and she was ordered to pay significant damages, both to Susan for emotional harm and to the community members who had joined the suit after our initial filing. But that wasn't the most satisfying part. The judge, citing gross negligence and systemic abuse, ordered a complete audit of the HOA. Furthermore, Karen was removed from her position by court mandate and barred from serving on any residential board for 10 years. The HOA, under new supervision, would undergo reform and implement transparency protocols. The courtroom didn't erupt in applause. This wasn't a movie, but the collective exhale from those watching said everything. Outside the courthouse, news crews swarmed the steps. I declined to speak publicly again, but Susan gave a short, heartfelt statement. She spoke softly, but her words carried weight. She thanked the community for standing by her. She said her husband had always believed in quiet dignity, in standing up without shouting, and she said she was grateful that justice had a place, even in the smallest of neighborhoods. Reporters hung on every word. One of them asked her if she forgave Karen. Susan paused for a moment, then said, "Forgiveness is a gift. I hope she earns it someday." Karen, red-faced and silent, was whisked away through a side door. Her lawyer refused all comment. She disappeared from public view for a while after that. Her house eventually went up for sale. Rumors swirled that she had defaulted on her mortgage after legal fees drained her finances. What I do know is that the property sat empty for several months before it was purchased at a quiet auction by an anonymous buyer. The day the moving trucks arrived, I was in the front yard trimming hedges. I looked up to see the new owner stepping out of the car, a man in his early 40s with a familiar face. Susan's nephew. Apparently, he had followed the case closely and decided to make a move. With a grin, he told me he had no intention of selling. He liked the area, found it peaceful. The best part? The house had a guest unit in the back, a small, self-contained space with a private entrance. The very same type of arrangement Karen had once tried to outlaw through a proposed amendment. And wouldn't you know it, a month after moving in, he listed that unit online for short-term rentals. Legally. Registered. Approved by the new board, now run by Rick and a small team of reasonable, level-headed volunteers. Karen's old kingdom had become a place of fairness. An irony. As for us, we used a portion of the court-awarded damages to create something beautiful. In the corner of our backyard, we built a small memorial garden, a peaceful space with a stone bench, climbing roses, and a little plaque engraved with a quote from Susan's late husband, "Leave a place better than you found it." Susan visits it often, watering the flowers, reading on the bench, sometimes just sitting quietly. The HOA, now reformed, even agreed to fund monthly landscaping as part of a neighborhood beautification initiative. I didn't push for it. Rick offered it himself. Time passed. Things settled. The neighborhood healed. People waved more often. Block parties returned. Fines dropped to nearly zero. And Karen? She became little more than a cautionary tale. Occasionally, someone new would move in and ask about her, and the response was always the same. A smile, a shrug, and the phrase, "Oh, you don't want to go down that road." One afternoon, while walking with Susan past the duck pond, she turned to me and said, "I still don't understand how someone can be so cruel over such small things." I nodded, then replied, "Because for some people, control feels bigger than kindness." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Well, I hope she finds something better to hold on to." So do I. But I wasn't holding my breath. Because in the end, Karen had made one fatal mistake. She thought she was untouchable, that she could play judge and jury without ever facing consequences. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the quiet man next door, the one who always waved politely and never raised his voice, had spent his career serving real justice. Not for revenge, not for ego, but for balance. And sometimes the scales have to swing hard to find it.